28-year-old Patricia Kimble had to force herself to smile as she looked out at the laughing group of friends who filled her backyard. There was no question that the Saturday evening barbecue for her fellow Sunday school teachers and other members of the Elm Street Baptist Church had been a very big success. It was September 9th, 1995, and the early fall air had been warm without being hot, and the clouds passing now and then over the sun, along with the leafy trees that stood around the Kimble single-story greenhouse, offered just the right amount of evening shade. And not that long ago, this happy gathering would have represented everything that Patricia had ever wanted in life, and everything she had always loved about her small hometown of Pleasant Garden, North Carolina. There was her 26-year-old husband with his toothy smile, green eyes, and strong, sturdy build, and right next to him was Patricia's brother, Reuben, and his wife, Christy, and just off to Patricia's right, she could see her closest friends laughing and chatting as they began to gather up empty plates and leftovers and take them into the kitchen. And out of sight, but still within 30 miles of where Patricia was standing, there was the apartment complex where she worked as a manager, there was the building supply store that her husband owned, and there were the homes of her parents, her in-laws, and her cousins. But ever since Patricia's marriage 17 months earlier, the happiness that Patricia had expected to feel as she assembled these building blocks of a good life, husband, family, church, friends, and work, had slowly faded. And in its place was Patricia's growing sense that the future she had imagined when she walked down the aisle to exchange rings with the man she had loved ever since she first laid eyes on him might never materialize. Yes, she and Ted had their cozy 3-bedroom house on Brandon Station Court, and yes, they were both devout Christians who were active in their church, and yes, Patricia still hoped that she and Ted would start a family together. And yes, some of her anxieties, like the fact that the house she lived in had been robbed twice, had nothing to do with being married. Still, the break-ins had shattered the sense of security Patricia felt as she started her new life with Ted. Even though no one had been hurt, and the burglar who robbed them the second time had eventually been caught by police, now, no matter how hard Patricia tried to control her fear, she still felt her chest tighten every time she approached the house and saw an unfamiliar car in the driveway or parked out on the road. And maybe it was that feeling of always looking over her shoulder that had made every other event that had nibbled away at Patricia's dream of a safe and happy married life seem worse than it really was. But overall, it just felt to Patricia that the love and romance that brought her and Ted together 3 years ago had been totally replaced by practical daily routines. Instead of spending the weekend together camping in the mountains, she and Ted sat at the kitchen table and paid the bills, or cleaned the house, or mowed the lawn. And Patricia wouldn't have minded the feeling of settling into that kind of routine if she felt like she and Ted were still enjoying their time together. But lately, Patricia had begun to worry that after less than 2 years of marriage, she and Ted were already starting to grow apart. Maybe Ted was even having second thoughts about having married her. After all, Patricia knew that when she had first met Ted almost 5 years ago, back in 1990 at the church youth group, they had been just friends and definitely nothing more. And Patricia also knew that between 1991 and 1992, Ted had had a serious crush on Patricia's second cousin, the beautiful Janet Blakely. But by 1992, when Janet was getting ready to go off to college, Ted had suddenly seemed to notice Patricia in a different way. And it wasn't long before the slim, smart, dark-eyed woman with the knockout smile went from friend to sweetheart and then to wife, leaving Janet Blakely crying in the back of the church when the pastor had announced to the congregation that Ted and Patricia were engaged. At first, when Patricia tried to talk to Ted about their marriage, he had looked at her in surprise, then pulled her close and told her everything was good and she should stop worrying. But when Patricia brought the subject up again, Ted seemed irritated and impatient. And then, just 1 week before today's barbecue, Ted had told Patricia that he had just applied to work a 3 to 11 p.m. shift at a local textile company that manufactured all different kinds of fiber-based materials. Ted's announcement had taken Patricia completely by surprise. There was no question that the two of them had very different attitudes toward money. Patricia had always been a saver, while Ted was more of a spender. In fact, by the time Patricia was 16, she'd set enough money aside to buy her first car, used, and by the time she was 23, she had enough in the bank for a down payment on a house. Ted, on the other hand, loved all the extras that money could buy. outfitting his late-model Jeep Cherokee with all the options, and now he had his eye on a new motorcycle. For Ted, money and social status were very important. He and his younger brother, Ronnie Jr., had spent the early years of their childhood living in a small mobile home in a trailer park on the edge of Pleasant Garden. And Ted's father, an alcoholic, barely made enough money to keep the family afloat. All that had changed when Ron Sr. had given up drinking and taken his wife and 2 sons off to Liberty University in Virginia. After getting his degree in pastoral leadership, Ron Sr. had returned to North Carolina and settled his family in Julian, a few miles south of Pleasant Garden, where he was hired as the pastor of the Monnet Road Baptist Church. But even though the family's financial and social status had improved after Ted's father, Ron Sr., became a pastor, Ted still always was given a lot of responsibility. That included watching out for his younger brother, Ronnie Jr. He was very socially awkward and held back in school by a learning disability. Ronnie Jr. was just not nearly as quick and confident as his older brother was. Still, both boys had always worked hard. Ronnie mostly did odd jobs around the neighborhood until he joined the military and enlisted in the Marine Corps. Ted became such a good employee at the local home building store that when the business owner, Gary Lyle, retired, he sold Lyle's building supply at a very good price to Ted. But even though Patricia understood the reasons why her husband was ambitious and why he enjoyed owning luxuries his family had never been able to afford when he was young, there was just no way that Ted needed to get a second job, especially one that would leave Patricia, who was already spooked by the break-ins, alone at the house that late into the evening. As Patricia turned away from the backyard and stepped into the kitchen to help put away the leftover food, she tried not to think about another possible reason why her husband, the owner of his own successful business, might be looking for additional part-time production line work that paid under $6.50 an hour, so much less than he made at Lyle's Supply. The sound of clattering dishes suddenly brought Patricia's attention back to the present, and pulling on her apron, she gave herself a mental shake. What she really needed to do was stop all this worrying and trust in God's plan for her life. Besides, in another few weeks, she and Ted would be going on a marriage enrichment retreat, and Patricia was sure that once they had a chance to sit down and really talk to each other, they would both find new ways to connect with one another, and she could put all of her jitters and suspicions to rest. Still, Patricia felt a jolt when she finally heard the question that one of the women in the kitchen was repeating for the second time. It was one of Patricia's fellow Sunday school teachers, and she was asking Patricia if it was true that Ted was working at Precision Fabrics out in neighboring Greensboro. Summoning up one more smile, Patricia told her friend that yes, Ted would be starting there in 9 days, on Monday, September 18th. And then, bending over the dishwasher to hide her face, Patricia did her best to sound happy when she added, "And yeah, I think he's really looking forward to it." 1 month after the barbecue for members of the Elm Street Baptist Church, on Monday, October 9th, 1995, Patricia pulled into the parking lot at Cinnamon Ridge Apartments a few minutes before 8 a.m. Before heading into the office where she worked as the property manager, Patricia thought about the telephone call she had made 3 days earlier on Friday night. Patricia and Ted were both very close to Ted's former boss, Gary Lyle, who had basically passed Lyle's Supply Store on to Ted right after Ted and Patricia got married. But when Gary wasn't there, it was Gary's wife, Rose, that Patricia had talked to on the phone. Patricia had thought for a long time before making that phone call, but considering all that had happened in the last several weeks, Patricia had known that she had to confide in someone, even if what Patricia had to say sounded completely unbelievable. Now, sitting in her car and looking out at the clear sky of what was sure to be a beautiful fall day in North Carolina, Patricia put her hands together at her chest, lowered her head, and said a short prayer, hoping that the prediction she had made to Rose 3 days earlier would never come true. By 3:30 p.m., Patricia was ready to leave the office for the day and head home to 2401 Brandon Station Court and cut the grass. Patricia was glad that the day had been quiet and trouble-free at Cinnamon Ridge. 3 months earlier, in July, Patricia had had to evict one of the tenants at the apartment complex. The confrontation had been ugly, and the tenant had made threats against Patricia's life. As Patricia stood up at her desk and pulled on her light jacket, she said goodbye to her coworkers, and a few minutes later she'd hopped into her car and was making the 13-mile drive south to Pleasant Garden. All in all, it had been a good day. Patricia had used her lunch break to run an errand in Greensboro and to make a surprise stop at Lyle's Supply with a bag of hamburgers and french fries that she'd picked up at a local fast food restaurant for Ted's lunch. The two of them had avoided talking about money or about the fact that Ted wouldn't be home that evening until after his shift at Precision Fabrics, which ended at 11 p.m. Instead, they talked about what Ted's younger brother, Ronnie Jr., had planned for his short leave home from the Marine base where he was stationed at Camp Lejeune, 3 hours to the southeast in Jacksonville, North Carolina. Like most people who knew the Kimble brothers, Patricia had always been struck by the obvious favoritism that their parents had always shown for Ted. That had always made her feel a little protective of her awkward but straight-arrow brother-in-law, and glad he had met and married his fresh-faced and cheerful wife, Kimberly. Patricia had also reminded Ted that after she mowed the grass that afternoon, she'd be going to a Bible study group that was meeting at 7 p.m. at the church. But at about 4 o'clock, as soon as Patricia caught sight of her house on Brandon Station Court, she knew right away that she'd be changing her afternoon plans. And when she pulled into the driveway of the one-story green home with the American flag next to the door, she smiled, pulling her car over to the far left so she could squeeze in next to the vehicle already parked in her driveway. It didn't matter that Patricia was now parked halfway on top of the grass she intended to cut, because as she turned off the engine and hopped out of the car and headed to the front door, she knew she was not going to be mowing the lawn, at least not yet, because Patricia Kimble had company. A little over 4.5 hours later, the first Pleasant Garden fire engine, lights flashing and volunteer firefighters in full protective gear clinging to the outside grips, came screeching around the bend of Brandon Station Court. All eyes were already on number 2401, the one-story green house that now had waves of thick, muddy-looking smoke pouring out from under the front door and the openings in the chimneys, windows, and vents. And none of these first responders needed to be told that this house belonged to Patricia and Ted Kimble. Because the dispatcher at the fire department, who had taken the 911 call at 8:46 p.m. that evening reporting a house fire at 2401, had been Patricia's godfather. The emergency call was also personal for the lead firefighter, who had hopped down from the jump seat on the fire engine even before the truck had come to a full stop. 24-year-old Alan Fields had gone to high school with Ted Kimble, and he knew Patricia's family, the Blakeleys, even better. According to dispatch, Patricia's brother, Reuben, had gotten a call at about 8 p.m. from Ted at Precision Fabrics, asking Reuben to go check on Patricia, who had not been answering Ted's telephone calls. Now, even before his crew had connected the hose to the nearest fire hydrant, Alan could feel the intense heat coming off the house in waves as he and his fellow firefighters rushed through the carport to the side door of the house that led into the kitchen. But nothing in Alan's 6 years with the fire department had prepared him for the blast of superheated air and smoke that smothered him and his crew as soon as they had pushed through that door. And less than a minute later, unable to see and unable to breathe, Alan frantically motioned his crew backward. As they stumbled back out of the house and pulled off their masks to drink in huge gulps of fresh air, somewhere above and around them, the firefighters could hear the crackle and snap of nearby leaves and tree branches sucking in the heat from the house below. And out in the street, under the flashing lights of the fire engines and the sheriff department cars, firefighters could make out the growing crowd of neighbors and family and friends of the Kimbles and the Blakeleys. Even as Alan called for high-powered fans to clear the smoke from the interior of the house, every firefighter there was already thinking about the sight of Patricia Kimble's car parked over the edge of the driveway, wondering if she was inside, still alive, waiting for them. Just then, Alan heard a shout from the front corner of the house. Using a long metal rod, one of the firefighters had smashed through one of the bedroom windows, hoping they might be able to pull out Patricia or anyone else in the house who might be crouching just on the other side of the wall. But even as the firefighter reached his arm through the window, there was a sudden burst of flames as the oxygen pouring in from outside reignited the hot embers inside. As another team passed a hose through the broken window to douse the fire that had just erupted, Allen and his crew pushed back into the kitchen, following the stream of air from the fans that was slowly knocking aside the walls of smoke. As the pressurized stream from the hose began hitting the walls and floor and ceiling, the air in the kitchen, then the living room, and then the hallway was filled with the sound of sizzling water. Working in the lead, Allen could just barely make out in the darkness the long strips of paint that had blistered and peeled off the walls, and the burned and smoking insulation and crumbling sheetrock scattered around their heavy boots, when suddenly, the floor just seemed to disappear right from under Allen's feet. One second he was standing, and the next, he felt himself falling and rolling into a small space under the hallway, a 4-foot deep hole that had burned through the floorboards. But before Allen could even process what had just happened, he was suddenly aware of something firm but yielding underneath him. As Allen put out one gloved hand to steady himself, he suddenly knew with terrible certainty that they had just found 28-year-old Patricia Kimble. By the time Detective Jim Church from the Guilford County Sheriff's Department met up with his supervisor at 2401 Brandon Station Court that night, sheriff deputies had already strung yellow tape around the Kimble's property to hold back the crowd of spectators, and crime lab technicians and Guilford County fire inspectors were already combing through the smoking rubble inside the house. But within minutes, a simple walkthrough of the damaged building, lit by portable floodlights, told Detective Church and Sergeant Detective David DeBerry a lot of what those techs and inspectors would later confirm. The most important and obvious piece of that information was that the fire that had killed Patricia Kimble had not been an accident. Sitting right in the middle of the kitchen was an empty gasoline can, and Detective Church, who was also a volunteer firefighter, pointed out the obvious burn pattern caused by an accelerant like gasoline that led from the kitchen over the back of a couch in the living room and then down the hallway to where Patricia's body had been discovered. The detectives and fire inspector would also agree that whoever had set the fire had probably hoped it would burn long and hot enough to destroy the entire house. Instead, the fire had probably only burned intensely for maybe a few minutes, not hours, leaving the bedrooms in the house practically untouched by actual flames. And those bedrooms, especially the Kimble's master bedroom, told their own part of the story. As investigators stood in the doorway and took in the sight of the emptied-out dresser drawers, overturned nightstand, and the mattress pulled off the bed, they both came to the same conclusion. Before setting the fire, the arsonist had tried to make it look like the house had been robbed. Except the arsonist had not done a very convincing job, leaving behind items like an expensive camera that were of obvious value. There had also been no sign of forced entry into the house. The pry marks that deputies had discovered on the side door into the house were marks that had been left from the robbery that had taken place earlier in that same year. While investigators would go on to spend hours tracking down the robbery gone wrong angle, their initial take on this crime was that the robbery had been staged to cover up the death of Patricia Kimble, and not that Patricia had been killed when she walked into her house and surprised a burglar. There was also the fact that Patricia's car was parked half on the driveway and half on the grass that suggested to detectives that when Patricia had arrived home, there had to have been another vehicle already parked in the driveway. Otherwise, Patricia, who intended to cut the grass, would not have parked on top of the grass. And whoever had been driving that vehicle had to have been someone Patricia knew or recognized. After experiencing 2 traumatic break-ins, police believed there was just no way that Patricia would ever have unlocked her door and entered the house with someone she didn't know. But even before detectives stepped into the room inside of Patricia's house, where her body was now laying on a white sheet, detectives knew that they were not going to have much in the way of physical and forensic evidence to help them in this investigation. Between the fire, smoke damage, and the water from the fire hoses that now sloshed around their feet, they knew that the crime scene techs were just not going to find anything in the way of fingerprints or DNA. Still, the first horrible sight of Patricia's body was enough to make every law enforcement officer in that house 100% committed to finding whoever had set this fire. Surrounded by the ruins of her own wedding pictures and cross-stitched framed Bible verses, nothing recognizable remained of the beautiful, vibrant young woman with the chocolate brown eyes and infectious smile. Patricia lay face down with her arms, bent at the elbow, raised above her head. All but one tuft of clothing had been burned from her body, and only charred stumps remained where her left foot and entire right leg should have been. Around her, patches and smears of bright red blood were the only signs that this had once been a living, breathing human being. And then, scanning the length of the ravaged body, both detectives saw it at the same time. Directly behind Patricia's left ear, there was a small, dark bullet hole. And suddenly, everything about this case changed. Patricia had to have been shot from behind in the head, and by the time the arsonist had staged the robbery and then set the fire, Patricia was already dead. Within 4 days of Patricia's murder, police had already ruled out the most obvious suspects. At the top of that list was Patricia's husband, Ted, not because of any obvious evidence, but because most violent homicides are committed by people close to the victim. But not only was Ted in a state of shock that there was anyone in Pleasant Garden who would want to hurt Patricia, he also had a cast iron alibi for the time of the murder, which the medical examiner had determined must have occurred just after 4 p.m. on the afternoon of October 9th, not long after Patricia had arrived home from work, intending to mow the grass. Answering every question put to him by police, Ted explained that from the time he left his house on that Monday morning at 7:45 a.m. until the time he called Patricia's brother, Ruben, at 8 p.m. to ask Ruben to go check on Patricia, Ted was either at work at Lyle's Supply or at Precision Fabrics. And in between those two jobs, he had met up with his mother, Edna Kimble, for dinner at Mrs. Winter's Chicken and Biscuits, a local restaurant not far from Precision Fabrics. Ted's account of Patricia stopping by in the afternoon to meet him for lunch, along with a call he made to her office at Cinnamon Ridge later in the afternoon, just before she left work, also lined up with what police had learned about Patricia's last day from her coworkers. Police also quickly ruled out 2 other suspects. The man who had broken into the Kimble house early in 1995 could not have murdered Patricia because he was still in jail at the time. Still, Detective Church conducted an interview with the suspect and went over the facts of the earlier break-in. Investigators also tracked down the tenant that Patricia had recently evicted from Cinnamon Ridge Apartments, but she too had an alibi for the time of the murder. But even as detectives seemed to be hitting one dead end after another, they were also turning up more and more information about growing strains between Patricia and Ted in the weeks leading up to Patricia's murder. Patricia had confided to friends that she and Ted argued about Ted spending too much money. Ted had also tried to take out $100,000 of life insurance on his wife, and Patricia had absolutely refused to sign off on the policy. Those same friends also told police that when Ted started working his part-time job at Precision Fabrics about 1 month before Patricia's death, Patricia had worried that he hadn't taken the job because he wanted more money. Instead, he had taken the job because he wanted to spend less time with Patricia. And despite the fact that Ted had an alibi and that he never collected on that life insurance policy, police continued to treat Ted as a suspect, circling back again and again to ask him more questions about his relationship with his wife and looking for inconsistencies in the story Ted had told police about his activities on the day of Patricia's murder. It wasn't until Ted hired a lawyer and later posted a $10,000 reward for information leading to the arrest and conviction of Patricia's murderer that investigators were forced to leave Ted Kimble alone and admit that the homicide investigation into Patricia's death had started going cold. But for Detective Jim Church, this was a case he just could not let go of. And over the next 14 months, the 49-year-old investigator kept track of any new developments in the lives of Patricia Kimble's family and friends. He also reached out beyond Patricia's immediate circle to interview Ted's brother Ronnie out at Camp Lejeune and any of the women that Ted had dated before he married Patricia, including Patricia's cousin, Janet Blakely. But it wouldn't be until late January 1997, more than 1 year after Patricia Kimble's murder, that Detective Church finally got the tip that would break his first homicide investigation wide open. And when that tip came in, Detective Church literally could not believe the identity of the caller, the tipster, at the other end of the telephone line. It was the son of Reverend Jerry Falwell, the founder of Liberty University in Virginia and one of America's best-known Baptist pastors, televangelists, and conservative activists. And according to Jerry Falwell's son and attorney, one of the students enrolled at Liberty University's training program for pastors had just given the Reverend Jerry Falwell Sr. the name of someone who might be involved in the death of Patricia Kimble. And a little over 2 months later, Detective Church and Detective DeBerry, along with investigators from the North Carolina Special Bureau of Investigation, were ready to make their first arrests on charges of first-degree murder. Based on the investigation into the tip from Reverend Falwell, here is a reconstruction of what police believe really happened to Patricia Kimble 16 months earlier, on the afternoon of October 9th, 1995. Patricia's killer was patient. Waiting at the Kimble's house, the killer was grateful that 2401 was the only house that had been built yet on Brandon Station Court. It was still possible, but really not very likely, that a neighbor might notice the vehicle in the driveway. Besides, it was not really in the killer's nature to worry about those types of details. Instead, the killer had let themselves inside the house and prepared for the moment when Patricia came home. The killer was methodical. Once they had taken up their position inside the bathroom, just off the hallway that led from the living room down to the 3 bedrooms, the killer racked the slide of the Glock 45 pistol one more time, checked that the bathroom door was not closed all the way, then carefully made another mental review of the plan. It wasn't that the killer disliked Patricia. It wasn't even that the killer stood to benefit from Patricia's death. There were just some responsibilities in life that could not be argued or bargained away. And killing Patricia was one of those obligations. And this would be a fast and merciful death. The killer thought about that and decided that Patricia probably would not even feel any pain, just surprise. Meanwhile, a few miles away, Patricia had stopped her car at an intersection and waved a quick hello to another driver. As Patricia let up on the brake and moved forward again, she thought how completely ordinary her life must seem from the outside. And after spending her lunch with Ted at Lyle's Supply earlier that day, and picking up the phone this afternoon and hearing his familiar voice, Patricia wondered if maybe there was hope for their marriage after all. She had seen how bitter and destructive divorce had been for her own parents, and if she could avoid going down that road herself, she would. And with that thought in mind, Patricia took a deep breath and forced herself to concentrate on the here and now. It was a beautiful, warm afternoon, and it would feel good to get outside and cut the grass, and maybe do some other yard work before getting changed and cleaned up for her evening Bible study group. But when Patricia rounded the curve of Brandon Station Court and saw the vehicle that was sitting in her driveway, her spirits suddenly lifted. This was unexpected, but unlike a lot of the things that had been happening lately in Patricia's life, a visit with this person was unexpected in a good way. Smiling, Patricia pulled her car into the driveway and parked half on the asphalt and half on the grass. A moment later, and Patricia was walking through the open doors of the 2-car garage. Calling out a cheerful hello, she reached the side entrance into the kitchen, pushed it open, and stepped inside. Patricia was a little surprised when she heard a slightly muffled answer coming from deeper inside the house, but she didn't hesitate before following the voice down the hallway that led to the bedrooms. And this was exactly the moment the killer had been waiting for. As soon as Patricia passed the closed bathroom on her left, she never even noticed when the door opened behind her. Silent as a ghost, the killer stepped forward, pressed the barrel of the gun against the back of Patricia's skull just behind her left ear, and pulled the trigger. Inside the small house, the blast from the gun was deafening. But even as Patricia's body fell forward onto the hallway floor, arms raised over her head, the killer was already on the move. Picking up the can of gas they had hidden in the bathroom, the killer started in the kitchen and poured a stream of gasoline that led through the living room, over the living room sofa, and down the hallway to Patricia's dead body. Standing over Patricia, the killer poured until Patricia's body was soaked and dripping. Satisfied, the killer headed for the master bedroom. Once there, the killer pulled out the dresser drawers, tossed out the clothes, knocked over the nightstand, and pulled the mattress off the bed. Pausing long enough to catch their breath, the killer went back down the hallway, picked up the empty can of gasoline, and then walked quickly into the kitchen, putting the can down on the floor where police would find it almost 5 hours later. Taking a few steps backward, the killer took the packet of matches out of their pocket. There was a scraping sound as the head of the match dragged along the strike plate, and then a hiss as the match caught fire. Flicking the lighted match towards the puddle of gasoline, the killer only stayed long enough to make sure the flames caught as the fire began its journey from the kitchen, through the living room, over the sofa, and finally going up in a roar as it reached the body laid out in the 12-foot-long hallway. A minute later, and the killer was gone. Late in January of 1997, 16 months after Patricia's murder, Ronnie Jr. and his wife Kimberly were out in Lynchburg, Virginia, visiting one of Ronnie's old friends. Mitch Whidden was a former Marine who was now enrolled in the Pastoral Leadership Program at Liberty University, the same program and the same university where Ronnie Jr.'s own father had studied back when Ronnie was just a boy. It was also the same program and university where Ronnie had decided that he would like to go once his military service was over. Mitch knew that Ronnie had been very affected by the tragic and unsolved murder of his sister-in-law, Patricia, and Mitch hoped that his friend's decision to go into the ministry would help Ronnie find comfort and direction in his life. But when the two friends sat down together in the evening to pray, Mitch was totally shocked at the change that suddenly came over Ronnie when Mitch began to read out loud from the Bible. Jumping to his feet, Ronnie paced back and forth across the room before slamming his hands against his head, and then he turned to face Mitch and he said, "I did it. I killed her. I killed Patricia." One day later, on Saturday, January 25th, Mitch drove to Liberty University and put in a desperate request to speak to the university founder, Reverend Jerry Falwell Sr. Mitch needed Reverend Falwell's advice. Mitch had heard a murder confession from a friend, but the friend had refused to turn himself into the police. Within minutes, the Reverend's son, an attorney, was calling Detective Church at the Guilford County Sheriff's Department, advising the detective to go speak with a seminary student at Liberty University named Mitch Whidden. Detective Church did not waste any time. 9 days later, Mitch Whidden was talking directly to Detectives Church and DeBerry, along with an agent from the North Carolina Special Bureau of Investigation. And according to Mitch Whidden, Ronnie Kimble had not acted alone. On the night that Ronnie confessed to Mitch that Ronnie had killed Patricia, Ronnie had also said that it was his older brother, Ted, Patricia's husband, who had asked him to commit the murder. Although Ted had promised his younger brother a cut of the life insurance money Ted expected to collect after Patricia was dead, Ronnie had told Mitch that he agreed to kill Patricia because Ronnie would rather die than say no to his older brother. It would turn out that in the months leading up to her death, Patricia Kimble had every reason to be worried, not only about her marriage, but also about her personal safety. Patricia had been upset when Ted pressured her to sign off on a life insurance policy that would have paid Ted $100,000 in the event of Patricia's death and $200,000 in the event that Patricia died an accidental death, like, for example, if she was burned to death in a tragic house fire. What Patricia did not know until just days before her death was that after Patricia had refused to sign off on that insurance policy, Ted had forged her name on the policy and submitted it to the insurance company. What Ted apparently did not know when he forged Patricia's signature and when he asked his brother Ronnie to kill Patricia was that the insurance company needed more than just Patricia's signature to issue the policy. They also needed Patricia to take a series of blood tests as well as a physical examination in order to approve the paperwork. And when the insurance company agent and the doctor's office called to schedule those tests, saying they had Patricia's signature on the policy, Patricia had become hysterical, said no to the tests, and slammed down the phone. It was on Friday, October 6th, 1995, 3 days before her murder, and right after Patricia had found out about the forgery, that she called Gary and Rose Lyle and told Rose that if anything ever happened to her, Patricia, police should investigate her husband, Ted. What Patricia had never suspected was that Ted, who had always seemed to wield a lot of power and influence over his younger brother Ronnie, would somehow persuade or pressure Ronnie to actually harm or kill Patricia. And apparently, Patricia was murdered before the insurance company had time to contact Ted and tell him that the company could not issue the insurance policy he had requested for his wife Patricia, and upon her death, Ted would not be collecting on the forged policy. Right from the start of the investigation, Detectives Church and DeBerry suspected that Ted had to be involved, and they had even begun to suspect that Ronnie Jr. may have conspired with Ted to kill Patricia. But without a confession, and without any hard physical evidence that linked either brother to the crime, the investigation had ground to a halt. However, in the months before Ronnie's confession to his friend Mitch Whiddon, Detective Church continued to collect information that suggested to police that Ted's motive for getting married in the first place was money. Gary Lyle, Ted's employer at Lyle's Building Supply, had made it clear that he was more likely to sell his business to Ted if Ted were married and settled down. And Patricia's cousin, Janet Blakely, was one of at least 2 women who had all turned down Ted's marriage proposals. Janet's tears when she learned about Patricia's engagement to Ted had less to do with envy and more to do with concern for Patricia, who was wearing the engagement ring that Ted had offered to Janet just 1 month earlier. Police even speculated that Ted's decision to get part-time work at Precision Fabrics was just to make sure that he would have an alibi when he arranged for Patricia's murder. It would also turn out that Ted had a history of running insurance scams. He overreported the number of items that had been stolen from the Kimble house in those 2 earlier robberies, and he also inflated the claims related to the fire damage on the house. Ted would also be charged with stealing construction supplies from local businesses and from a local church that he would later sell at Lyle's Supply. On March 31st, 1997, more than 17 months after the brutal murder of Patricia Kimble, police arrested Ted and Ronnie Kimble on charges of first-degree murder, arson, and conspiracy to commit murder. In September of 1998, almost 3 years after killing his sister-in-law, Ronnie Jr. was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison without parole. 3 months later, and 1 month before Ted was scheduled to go on trial, a search of Ted's prison cell revealed detailed escape plans, along with Ted's plans to hire someone to kill 5 witnesses who were scheduled to testify against him. Included on that hit list were Gary Lyle, the man who gave Ted his start in business, and Gary's wife Rose, Patricia's telephone confidant. 2 months after police discovered Ted's hit list, Ted Kimble avoided a jury trial by pleading guilty to a lesser charge of second-degree murder along with arson and conspiracy. In January of 1999, a little over 3 years after Patricia's murder, Ted Kimble was sentenced to 107 years in prison. One afternoon in the spring of 1990, a young mother tidied up her family's living room in Pingyang Township, which is a small rural community made up of several villages in southern China. And she was almost done when she heard her 3-year-old twin daughters start to cry. And this really caught her off guard, because even though these kids were only 3 years old and 3-year-olds cry, well, her daughters basically never cried. They were like silent all the time. The girls' names were Shi Tsai and Shi Hongwu, and they'd been really easy babies because they were basically quiet all the time and just wanted to sleep. However, as they got older, their silence became more concerning. All they really wanted to do was just lay around and sleep and do nothing. Even at 3 years old, they hadn't even said their first words yet. So, when this mom heard these girls crying, she rushed down the hall to see what was going on. 1, just obviously to make sure her kids were okay, but 2, just out of curiosity. This is so uncharacteristic to be making any noise at all. And so the mom, she burst into the nursery and she saw her girls in their crib and they were sobbing hysterically, totally upset. And the mother rushed over and she scooped them up and asked, what's going on? Are you okay? But of course the girls didn't say anything because they didn't speak. They just continued to cry. But the mom, she kind of assessed her kids and couldn't see any injuries. They didn't seem sick. They were just upset about something, but she had no idea what it was. And so the mom just stood there comforting her girls until they calmed down, and then she put them back into the crib and they both went to sleep. And that was it. A couple of days later, and the twin girls were back to their normal routine, being totally silent and sleeping for most of the day. And as the girls slept in their nursery, their mom just went around the house doing some housework, and at some point, she walked down the hallway past the girls' bedroom. Now, their door to the nursery was shut, and again, they're just sleeping and being totally quiet. The mom hasn't heard them at all day. And as she's walking down the hallway, she suddenly comes to an abrupt stop right outside the nursery door, because distinctly she can hear her girls making noise in their room. But they're making a noise that just doesn't make any sense to the mother. Her daughters were not crying or fussing or anything like that. They were talking. At first, the mother wanted to rush in there and experience this firsthand, this landmark moment of her girls speaking for the first time. But she also worried if she went in there, they might go silent and she'd ruin the moment. And so instead, she just pressed her ear to the door and just listened. And as she listened, she really couldn't believe what she was hearing. Because these girls weren't just babbling, saying random words. These girls were having like a full-blown conversation with each other, like adult-level sentences being spoken back and forth. These girls who apparently, at least according to the mother, couldn't even speak. Like, how is this even happening? However, the more the mother listened to her daughters, the more unsettled she became. Not only because, she's listening to her daughters speak for the first time at like an adult level, which is totally bizarre, but the content of this discussion her 3-year-old daughters are having made no sense. These girls were talking about stuff that they could not possibly know. The girls were talking in detail about people and events from a totally different village. A village their mother knew they had never been to, had never even heard of, and certainly didn't know anybody who lived there. Now, in basically every other part of the world, if a mother suddenly heard her 3-year-old twins, who had never said a word before, suddenly having adult-level conversations with each other about people and places that they can't possibly know about, that might be enough to spurn that mother to at least call their doctor. But this mom, well, she lived in Pingyang Township, and that meant, when she heard what her daughters were saying, as alarming as it was, she actually did know what was going on. Pingyang Township has a very strange secret, and that secret is that of the approximately 7,000 residents who live there, over 100 claim to be the reincarnated spirits of people who have died traumatic deaths. And this is not just some wacky thing these people are saying. No, in Pingyang Township, it's not just those 100 people who believe they really are reincarnated. It's the whole community. All 7,000 some odd people 100% believe that these people truly are reincarnated. And so how that plays out is that periodically, the reincarnated folks will go to a non-reincarnated person in the township and will claim things like, hey, in my past life, your family owed me a debt, and so now you're going to pay it out. And these non-reincarnated people will absolutely pay that debt. Or in other cases, there have been fights, physical altercations that have come from a reincarnated person approaching a non-reincarnated person and basically saying, in a previous life, you or your family or your relatives insulted me in some capacity, my previous self, and we're going to fight about it right now. And those fights take place in this town, and it's totally normal. But the interactions between the reincarnated and non-reincarnated people in this township, it's not just about conflict. In fact, there's been lots of decisions made in this township that are designed very specifically to avoid conflict between the reincarnated and non-reincarnated. For example, there was a little boy who claimed to be the reincarnated spirit of a pig who was butchered in town, and the butcher, who this boy said butchered him when he was a pig, well, the butcher, to make sure he was not offending this boy or potentially other people who were, the reincarnated spirits of other animals he had slaughtered, the butcher shut down his business just to be like, I don't want to offend you all. I'll find something else to do with my life. And so when this mother heard the sound of her twin girls who had never spoke before, suddenly having this detailed conversation about people and events from this other village, as jarring and shocking as that was for her, because she lives in Pingyang, she instantly understood that the only way my girls could have that information and be able to have this conversation is if they are reincarnated spirits. And so this mother did what she thought was right, which was not to call a doctor, but instead to get the word out to the people not just in her village, but across the Pingyang township that her twin daughters are actually reincarnated spirits. The mother's hope was that perhaps there were still family of these reincarnated spirits in this other village her daughters were referencing in their conversation that would find out about this, and maybe they'd want to come here and meet their family who now live inside of her daughters. And sure enough, less than a week after this mother got the word out, this man and woman who she didn't know came knocking at her door. When the mother let them inside the house, her girls immediately recognized them. One of the twins said that this was her mother and father from her previous life. Then the twins, these little 3-year-old girls, went on to tell this unbelievably complicated and sophisticated story about how in their previous life, these twin girls were not actually sisters. Instead, they were best friends, and together they had taken their own lives approximately 1 month before they were reborn in the bodies of these twin girls. And so after that, the twins just continued talking to this man and woman for quite some time, giving specific details about this village that, again, these girls, at least according to their mother, had never been to before. These girls also gave intimate details about these teenage girls' lives and even had information that was very specific to what happened to them when they took their lives and, where their bodies were found. Again, information these girls shouldn't have. And then at some point, the mother of the twins asked this man and woman, like, "Are these details they're giving you accurate? Is this true?" And the man and woman said, "Yep, it's all true." And then at some point, the twins turned to their biological mother, and they told her that the reason they had been silent to this point was because they were trying to keep their reincarnation a secret. And also, the reason they slept all the time is because when they slept, they would dream about their previous lives, which they claimed to miss. To this day, no one's ever been able to offer a better explanation for how these twin girls, these toddlers, had such accurate information about people they had never met and places they'd never been to. Basically, the only explanation that works is that they must actually be the reincarnated spirits of those teenage girls. Pingyang Township remains a hotspot of alleged reincarnations, and nobody knows why. Our next story is called More Than a Feeling. At around 5 p.m. on August 29, 1954, a 53-year-old woman named Juliet Exline had just sat down on her couch with a book inside of her home in Los Angeles when she got this weird wave of anxiety that kind of rushed over her. Now, there was nothing she could think of that would cause her to feel this way, and she even looked around her house thinking, maybe there was something weird going on, but there was nothing. And so finally, Juliet, she put her book down and just took a few calming breaths to kind of go back to normal. Like, she didn't know what was going on, but she could tell she was super anxious. Now, generally speaking, Juliet was a very mellow person. She was not prone to anxiety attacks like this, and so that kind of caught her off guard. And the only thing she could think of that was different than normal was her husband, Larry, was on a much-needed vacation, and so the last couple of days while he'd been gone had been maybe more lonely in the house, and so maybe that was causing her to feel this weird stress. She didn't know. But she told herself, Larry's vacation was definitely a good thing. Larry was an exterminator, and over the past 2 years, he had not taken a single day off. He was a total workaholic. And so when Larry began to talk about wanting to take a break, Juliet had encouraged him to put in time for some vacation time, put in a request. And Frank had actually done that, and as soon as his boss had approved a 2-week-long vacation, Larry had been so pumped he had called his friend, and they had immediately scheduled a fishing trip, and 4 days before, Frank and his friend had driven off to enjoy his time off. And so as Juliet thought about that, she told herself that, even if she was feeling a little bit anxious about Larry being gone, it really was a good thing for Larry, and it would improve not only his life, but her life as well. This was overall a good thing, and so she just needed to kind of deal with this anxiety that maybe or maybe not was connected to Larry. She didn't know. But for the rest of that evening, Juliet just could not get rid of this kind of baseline low-level nervousness she was feeling, And so at some point, she began getting up and walking around her house and confirming all the windows were shut and locked and the doors were locked. She was drawing curtains, checking in closets, making sure everything was totally safe. And then by 8 p.m., when she still just could not shake this anxiety, she decided she just needed to go to bed and kind of sleep this off. But after falling asleep, Juliet suddenly woke up at 10:15 p.m., drenched in sweat, with the most intense anxiety she had ever felt in her life. And she was totally disoriented. She's looking around her room like, what's going on here? And then she heard a voice. It was Larry's voice, except he sounded funny. He sounded like quiet, as if maybe he was outside the house trying to come in and he was calling to her. And so kind of in a panic, she jumped out of bed, ran into the hallway, and right in the hallway was Larry. He wasn't outside. He was right there. Except something was wrong with Larry. He was kind of hunched over and grabbing his stomach. He had his hand on the wall, and he also appeared to be soaking wet. And so Juliet had no idea what was going on, but between all that anxiety and now seeing Larry here in this weird state, she couldn't help herself. She just ran towards him to just make sure he was okay. But as soon as she got about a foot away from him, he held out his hand and said, "No, don't touch me. I have to go back." And what he said was so disorienting that Juliet just stopped and stared at her husband like, what is this? And that's when she made the startling realization that Larry was not soaking wet with water. He was soaking wet with blood. And he was clutching his stomach like something was bleeding in his midsection. And the reason he had sounded so quiet when he had called out to her and woken her up was because he was clearly hurt. And so Juliet has no clue what's going on. Like, her husband was supposed to be 7 hours away on this fishing trip. And so how is he here? It didn't make any sense. And so really not knowing what else to do, Juliet just said, I'm going to call the doctor. And so she ran past Larry, headed to the kitchen, and she was about to grab the phone on the wall. But before she could grab it, the phone began to ring. And so Juliet just answered it and said, hello, hello. And what she heard was the sound of a sheriff in Ely, Nevada. And he said, excuse me, is this Mrs. Exline, Juliet Exline? And she said, yes, what's going on? What's happened? And the sheriff said, ma'am, I'm sorry to tell you this, but I have some terrible news. Your husband got into a car accident, and unfortunately, he has passed away. And now the second the sheriff said this to Juliet, she just froze and goes, no, that's not possible. He's here with me right now. And Juliet turned around and looked into the hallway where Larry had been standing, and now Larry was gone. Larry really had died in that car accident because Juliet would bury her husband that week. But Juliet maintained that clearly after her husband had died, his spirit had somehow survived the accident, because when she saw her husband standing in the hallway, hunched over and covered in blood, it was at 10:15 p.m. She remembers because when she woke up, she saw the time. It was 10:15. And her husband had died at exactly 10:15 p.m., the exact moment she saw him in the hallway. Juliet would ultimately write an account of what she experienced with her husband. However, from that day forward, she never once saw her husband again. That was the only time. The next and final story of today's episode is called 1,000 Tortured Souls. Late one night in November of 1999, a 66-year-old minister named Colin Grant opened up the iron gates of a cemetery called Greyfriars Kirkland. This cemetery was one of the oldest and most famous cemeteries in Edinburgh, Scotland. Now, the cemetery was basically pitch black. However, there were a few old iron lanterns that lined the cobblestone path that cut through the cemetery. And so Colin pushed open these big gates, and he stepped onto this path, and he began walking. And on either side of him, for as far as he could see, were all these headstones, some of which dated back to the 1600s. And as he kept walking, he could see up ahead, even in the darkness, the huge Gothic-style church that sat right in the center of the cemetery. Now, at first glance, this cemetery just kind of looked like a pretty typical old cemetery, albeit a pretty spooky one. But to Colin, he knew there was far more than just a graveyard here. Deep underground in the cemetery, below where all the people have been buried at their headstones, was basically another cemetery. There was like this mass burial pit that the cemetery had been built on top of. And in this lower level cemetery, which in no way was marked, I mean, this is basically a hidden mass burial, were thousands of people who had been starved and tortured to death hundreds of years ago. And so Colin stopped for a second on the path and just kind of stared ahead at this church. And for a second, he thought about just turning and leaving, because he did not want to be here. He was really only here because the city of Edinburgh had begged him to come here. Colin, in addition to being a minister, claimed to be a psychic, which meant he could speak to the dead. And so the city of Edinburgh, in desperation, had asked him to come to this cemetery tonight and perform an exorcism. And so as much as Colin did just want to turn around and leave, he knew he really had a duty here, not just to the city, but really to the people of the city. Because if he didn't do this exorcism, there was a good chance more people were going to get hurt. The only thing that was making Colin a little bit less afraid in this moment was he actually was not alone in the cemetery. There were two people with him. There was a journalist and a photographer from a local newspaper who were basically tagging along to document this exorcism. And so after taking a minute to compose himself, Colin continued walking deeper into the cemetery with these two following behind him, and then before reaching the big church, Colin left the path and began cutting through the grass, passing by different headstones, on the way to perhaps the most infamous building in the entire cemetery, the Black Mausoleum. The Black Mausoleum was this tall stone crypt with a rounded top that had been built sometime in the late 1600s. And as Colin got closer to this pretty creepy-looking building that sat basically on the side of the cemetery, Colin began to feel this really intense sense of dread come over him. And the closer he got, that dread began to kind of manifest itself in like a pit in his stomach, and eventually he began feeling really scared of this building. And eventually Colin actually had to fully stop about 10 or so feet away from the building because he just felt like he couldn't go any closer. It felt evil. And then Colin turned and looked at his companions, the journalist and photographer, to see if maybe they were reacting to this mausoleum, but the two of them were just standing there with blank expressions on their face, like obviously not thinking that anything sinister was happening here. You know, even though the city had asked the minister to be here to perform this exorcism in this mausoleum, you know, it didn't mean everybody believed what was going on here. And clearly these two didn't. They were totally skeptical. But this didn't offend Colin. He was used to people not believing in the things he believed in. And he knew as soon as he actually began his work, doing this exorcism, they would change their mind. And so at some point, Colin told the photographer that, hey, I'm going to go in the mausoleum now because I have to do the exorcism. Before I do, take a picture of the mausoleum. And so the photographer just raised her camera and took a picture of the mausoleum. Colin thanked her, and then he turned and began walking towards the building. When he got right in front of it, he looked up and he read the name across the top of the crypt. And it said George Mackenzie. And as Colin read that, he could feel his heart rate start to spike. So back in the late 1600s, George Mackenzie was a Scottish lord who worked for the King of England, enforcing the king's religious laws. But at the time, these laws were very unpopular. And there was one group called the Covenanters who hated these laws so much that they actually mounted a full-scale rebellion in 1679. But their rebellion failed miserably, and this is when George Mackenzie came in. He captured over 1,000 Covenanters, and he marched them all into this huge field, which would later become the Greyfriars Kirkland Cemetery, but at the time it was just a big open field, and he held them there, and for weeks he had these people starved and tortured and mutilated, and if anybody tried to run or resist because they knew they were doomed, they all knew they were going to die here, if anybody took off, he would capture them, cut their head off, and then place their head on a spike around the perimeter of this field. Until, after several weeks, the entire field is just ringed with decaying bodies and bloody heads on spikes. And so after a few months of this, basically everybody in that field had been murdered in some horrible way by George Mackenzie. And their bodies were all dumped into a mass grave in Greyfriars Kirkland and covered over, and then, hundreds of years later, a proper cemetery would be built right on top of that mass grave. And then, when George Mackenzie died later on, he lived a normal, happy, full life after doing all these horrible things, they built him this beautiful mausoleum in Greyfriars Kirkland, in the proper cemetery. And so here's this horrible person, George Mackenzie, who's a mass murderer, and he's put to rest in this beautiful mausoleum, just, feet away from this mass grave of all these people he killed. For almost 300 years after Mackenzie was buried, the Greyfriars Kirkland Cemetery was quiet. It was not considered a haunted place. That all changed, though, in 1998, so that was 1 year before Colin showed up to perform this exorcism. That year, in 1998, a homeless man broke into the Black Mausoleum, and he fell through the floor and landed in one of those mass burial pits of those people Mackenzie had killed. And apparently, basically right after this happened, visitors to the cemetery began reporting the same thing, that anytime they were in or near the Black Mausoleum, they'd get pushed or tugged on or scratched or burned or even strangled. I mean, people were coming out of the cemetery terrified. And so quickly, people in town began to speculate about, what was going on in the cemetery. And quickly, a story began to circulate around town that maybe when that guy fell through the floor in the mausoleum, that had released George Mackenzie's evil spirit. And his spirit was responsible for all these attacks. And so it went on like this for about a year until finally this young woman was found outside of the Black Mausoleum, unconscious, looking like she'd been strangled. And when she came to, she had no memory of what happened. And so people assumed this had to be another attack by the spirit of George Mackenzie. And so by this point, the city of Edinburgh was totally fed up with this. They didn't know what to do. And so they said, you know what? Let's just try an exorcism. Let's have someone go into that mausoleum and literally confront the spirit of George Mackenzie and banish him. Get him out of here and stop this madness. And so ultimately Colin was hired to perform this exorcism. However, as Colin stood there, reading the name George Mackenzie and mentally preparing himself to go inside of this horrible place, he realized he just couldn't do it. This was too much. And so Colin is just standing there feeling totally stressed out. He's embarrassed. He feels like a coward. He has no idea what he's going to say to the photographer and journalist who've literally come out here to document what he's going to do, and now he's not going to do it. But as Colin turned around to basically blurt out this really embarrassing news that, hey guys, we got to leave, he realized he actually knew something else he could do that in many ways might actually be better than going into this mausoleum and doing an exorcism. And so without saying anything, Colin just turned and began speed walking over to this big field that was not too far away from the Black Mausoleum. And when he got there, he just began chanting prayers and walking in circles, flicking holy water, didn't explain anything he was doing to the journalist and the photographer who'd followed him over there and are just watching him like, what's going on here? They got no idea. He's not clarifying. And for hours, this is what he did. He just kind of paced in this field, just kind of doing what looked like stereotypical, exorcism type behavior. And that's what the journalist and the photographer assumed he was doing. And so as Colin did whatever he was doing in this field, the photographer, whose name was Susan Burrell, just began doing her job, again, thinking that he was doing the exorcism. And so she just started taking pictures of him. And then finally, around 2 a.m., so again, this has been hours of Colin doing this thing he's doing, Colin just abruptly stops and walks over to Susan and the journalist, and Colin looks horrible. He's totally haggard, his hair's all disheveled, he's sweating, he's pale, and his head is down, and he says to the two women, "I failed." He explained to them that his original intention was to go into the Black Mausoleum and confront George Mackenzie's spirit head on and banish him from the cemetery. However, he had had a change of heart at the door and decided to go this other route, which was to go to this big open field in the middle of the cemetery and attempt to free the spirits of all those Covenanters who had been tortured and killed by George Mackenzie. Colin's thinking was, if I can free all of these poor tortured souls, that maybe once they're gone, George Mackenzie's spirit will also go away. And while, according to Colin, he was able to free, 200 some odd trapped souls, he said there were many more that still needed to be freed, and he just didn't have the strength. Like, he couldn't do this right now. And so he said, I have to rest and do this at another time. Now, the journalist and the photographer were totally over this and did not care at all. It's 2 a.m. They don't really understand what he was doing. They don't really know if this was the exorcism or if it was something else. But to them, they're like, okay, fine. We'll get out of here. It's late. It's not a big deal. And so the three of them, they began walking out of the cemetery. And right when they got in front of the church, so basically between where the Black Mausoleum was and where that field was, where Colin had been for the past several hours, Colin abruptly stopped. And he told the journalist and the photographer that actually, you know what? he had a little strength left, and he felt like it was his duty to try this again, because he knew he could free more souls, and so he was going to give it another go. And so the journalist and the photographer are like, okay. And so Colin, he gets out his Bible and he begins kind of doing the same thing he was doing out in the field, walking around, chanting Bible verses, spraying holy water all around. And then at some point, for reasons he did not explain to either Susan or the journalist, he pulled out 12 candles from his backpack that he had brought along, and he put them in a circle on the ground right in front of this church. It also encompassed this big Celtic cross that was on the ground. And Colin was inside of the circle, and he lit all these candles, and the whole time again, he's chanting out these Bible verses, and he stands up, and right after all the candles have been lit, suddenly Susan and the journalist noticed the candles begin to flicker. And it's not windy at all inside the cemetery, like they shouldn't be flickering. And at the same time, Colin seemed to sense that something was happening around him, and he turned his whole body, his whole presence, and he looked over at the Black Mausoleum and began chanting these Bible verses louder and louder, like he was aiming them at the Black Mausoleum. And as he was doing this, the candles were flickering more and more and more, and at some point Colin actually picked up one of these candles and kind of held it out at the Black Mausoleum. And so at this point, the journalist and the photographer, Susan, they're sensing that something weird is happening here. Like, this is spooky what they're seeing. Like, why are the candles flickering? What's going on with Colin? Like, what's happening here? And for a minute, the two of them kind of abandoned their actual job, which is to document what they're seeing, and they just stood there kind of witnessing this totally bizarre event. But then Susan sort of broke out of it, she lifted up her camera, and right as Colin is passionately chanting out these verses, she takes a picture of him, and the second she does, the flash lights up the cemetery, and then after the flash goes away, Colin, it was like the light went out on him, and he just crumpled to the ground. And so the journalist immediately ran over to Colin to see if he was okay. And Colin, who's like barely conscious at this point, he just kept repeating, "This is going to kill me. This is going to kill me." And so Susan was about to run over and join her colleague and make sure Colin was okay. But before she did, she glanced down at her camera to see the picture she had taken of Colin right before he collapsed. And as she glanced at it, she couldn't believe what she was looking at. At first she thought, maybe this is some trick of the light, like this can't be right. But then she zoomed in on the photo, and when she looked closely, she screamed. Colin the minister is standing there with the candle outstretched, and behind him is the big church, and on the church, on the left side, there are windows. Now, this church was locked up. Nobody was inside the church at the time. But you can clearly see in the left window, there is a figure in that window looking out at Colin. Now, of course, this is not evidence enough to make everybody believe that, oh, that must be George Mackenzie's spirit staring out at Colin. He's the reason Colin collapsed. But I'll tell you, this photograph is not the end of the story. Remember, after Colin collapsed to the ground, after this photo was taken, the journalist ran over, and all Colin kept saying was, "This is gonna kill me, this is gonna kill me." Well, it would turn out he'd be right. Not long after this failed exorcism, Colin would die inexplicably. His death would come as a total shock to his friends and family. No one has ever been able to debunk the photo that Susan took that showed that dark figure in the window of the church, meaning nobody knows what that was. The church really was supposed to be empty and locked, and so how is there somebody or something in the window? Nobody knows. A lot of people think that could be the evil spirit of George Mackenzie, striking Colin down, and Susan managed to capture it on film. But, it's up to you if you believe that or not. But I will say, to this day, people go into that cemetery and come out with scratch marks on them and, claiming they were pushed or pulled or strangled. And so that cemetery is considered to be one of the most haunted places in the world. And George Mackenzie's spirit, who supposedly haunts it, is considered to be one of the most dangerous poltergeists in the world as well. From Ballen Studios and Wondery, I'm MrBallen, and this is MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, where every week we will explore a new, baffling mystery originating from the one place we all can't escape, our own bodies. If you like today's story, please ask the follow button if you can borrow their favorite hairbrush, and then when they say yes, only use it on your Maine Coon cat, and then without cleaning it, give it back. This episode is called The Sunless Burn. It was December 1979, and a young woman named Rose Harmon shivered in the cold at a bus stop in Madison, Wisconsin. The ground was covered in icy gray slush, and the whipping wind chilled her to the bone. But still, Rose couldn't help feeling cheery. All the lampposts around her were decorated with Christmas lights, and she just loved the way the city looked this time of the year. The 18-year-old high school student shifted her backpack from one shoulder to the other as her bus finally arrived at the stop. When the hydraulic doors opened, Rose stepped on board, and immediately it hit her how much warmer it was inside of the bus than it was outside, to the point where her cheeks flushed and she lowered the hood on her jacket. But as she walked towards the back of the bus, it just felt like the temperature inside the bus was only rising. Rose unbuttoned her parka, but it didn't help. She began sweating, and then suddenly Rose felt so overheated she could barely breathe. The edges of her vision went dark as she tried her best to gulp down air and get her coat off. She could hear people around her reacting to her strange, desperate behavior. Someone was telling the bus driver to pull over, call an ambulance. And then Rose felt a sharp pain in her knees as she collapsed to the floor, and then everything went black. A few hours later, Dr. Russell Chesney made his way to the intensive care unit at the University of Wisconsin Medical Center. Dr. Chesney was a kidney specialist, and any time he was paged to go to the ICU, it was usually bad news. And tonight was no exception. He just received a call from the emergency room letting him know that they were rushing a patient named Rose Harmon up to the ICU for kidney failure. When Dr. Chesney reached Rose's room, he saw a doctor standing at the foot of her bed, scribbling something down on a medical chart, while a nurse rummaged through a black backpack that was sitting on the cabinet along the wall. The doctor at the foot of the bed looked up as Dr. Chesney came inside the room, and the doctor kind of motioned to the unconscious young woman lying right there in the hospital bed with the oxygen mask strapped over her face. Dr. Chesney looked at Rose and felt his chest tighten. He knew Rose was only 18 years old, but in person, she looked even younger. She was far too young to be suffering from kidney failure. Dr. Chesney stepped closer to the bed and noticed that the girl's face and hands were covered in a blotchy pink rash that made it look like she was very badly sunburned. The doctor who had already been in the room told Dr. Chesney that Rose had come into the ER unconscious and with a very high fever. She was barely breathing, and when the doctor performed an initial exam, he heard crackling in her lungs. It was a warning sign that her lungs were filled with fluid, and they needed to perform a procedure to drain them. However, before they could extract the fluid, Rose's kidneys began to fail, and so that was when they had called Dr. Chesney. Dr. Chesney couldn't believe how quickly Rose seemed to be breaking down. And Dr. Chesney had never seen anything like this list of symptoms she had, especially her sunburn-like rash. He knew that Rose's body was in shock, which meant that it wasn't properly able to pump blood to all her organs. That was why her lungs and kidneys were failing. But he had no idea why Rose's body had gone into shock in the first place. And in order to save Rose, that was the question that Dr. Chesney would have to answer. Otherwise, even if he could stabilize her right now, she would eventually go back into shock. Given the rapid onset of Rose's symptoms, Dr. Chesney guessed that she must have contracted a very serious infection. He needed lab work to better understand what was wrong with Rose, but there was no time to wait for test results, which could take up to a couple of days. She needed help right now. A moment later, the nurse returned and told Dr. Chesney that she'd found Rose's ID in her backpack and contacted her parents. Dr. Chesney thanked the nurse and gave her a new task, to start Rose on a few different antibiotics. He hoped that one of them would stop the infection from spreading. And in the meantime, after they used a long needle to drain the fluid from her lungs, he would order as many tests as possible to identify the source of the infection. Dr. Chesney also decided to put Rose on dialysis, meaning a machine would now be flushing toxins from her kidneys, since her own kidneys were not able to do that. They were failing. While the nurses got everything started, Dr. Chesney left to go check on some other patients and promised he would be back soon. An hour later, Dr. Chesney turned back into Rose's room. The sunburn rash had spread up her arms, making her look even worse. He checked her vitals and was dismayed at what he saw. Rose's blood pressure had fallen, which meant that her body was not coming out of shock. So Rose's body still was not pumping enough blood to her organs. Dr. Chesney decided to give the antibiotics one more hour to maybe work. It was nearing the end of his shift, but he wanted Rose to stabilize before he left the hospital. But when Dr. Chesney came back to check on her the next time, he could immediately tell the antibiotics were still not working. The rash had spread even more. Now it fully covered Rose's arms and legs. Her blood pressure was even lower than before. Dr. Chesney was bewildered. The antibiotics should be able to fight off a wide variety of infections, so whatever Rose was fighting had to be extremely rare and very potent. Dr. Chesney clearly could not afford to sit around and wait for Rose's test results to come back, otherwise it would be too late to help her. So he ordered a chest x-ray, thinking maybe it would reveal that she had a bad case of pneumonia. As orderlies wheeled Rose's gurney toward the x-ray suite, a nurse came into the room and told Dr. Chesney that Rose's parents had arrived at the hospital. Dr. Chesney immediately hurried out into the waiting room, meeting the parents right as they stepped off the elevator. Dr. Chesney was anxious to speak with them about Rose's health and felt a pang of empathy at the looks of sheer terror on their faces. Dr. Chesney invited them to sit with him for a moment. He explained that Rose was getting a chest x-ray and they could see her after that. And in the meantime, he asked her parents to walk him through Rose's medical history. Specifically, he wanted to know if she'd been sick at all in the past week, or if anyone around her at home had been sick. But Rose's parents shook their heads, no. The mother assured the doctor that they'd all been feeling fine. They also hadn't received any word of any illnesses circulating at Rose's high school either. And the more they talked about Rose's medical history, the more it became apparent to Dr. Chesney that Rose was a very healthy, average 18-year-old girl. And so Dr. Chesney was stumped. Dr. Chesney didn't have any more questions to ask, so he thanked her parents and promised he'd come get them the moment they could see their daughter. Then he turned on his heels and hurried back down the hallway towards Rose's room, anxious for the results of her x-ray. Thankfully, as soon as Dr. Chesney arrived, Rose's nurse was putting up all the x-rays on a light box so he could look at them. And Dr. Chesney took one look at the x-rays and he gasped. Rose did not have pneumonia, but the reason she was having trouble breathing was very obvious. There was bleeding in her lungs. Dr. Chesney could clearly see that Rose's symptoms were getting more and more dire. But almost worse than that, they seemed kind of random and disconnected. They were not pointing him anywhere. There was one piece of good news, though. When Dr. Chesney checked Rose's vitals, he saw that her blood pressure was rising. This meant the treatments they were doing were finally working, and Rose was coming out of the shock. And so Dr. Chesney decided that Rose was stable enough for her parents to come see her, even if she would not be awake. So he turned out of Rose's room and headed back to the reception area where Rose's parents were waiting patiently, still looking absolutely terrified. He called them over and then led them back into their daughter's room, standing back to give them room by her bedside. He told the parents that, in his opinion, Rose would likely regain consciousness as her body stabilized. But what Dr. Chesney did not tell them was that he had no idea why their daughter's lungs were bleeding. He also had no idea why she landed in the hospital in the first place. Her symptoms were just totally confusing. And so Dr. Chesney knew he would need to consult with someone he trusted. So Dr. Chesney said goodnight to Rose's parents and he left the hospital and made his way to the home of a respected colleague. It also happened to be his own home. 20 minutes later, Dr. Chesney's wife, Joan, had just thrown 2 chicken breasts in the oven when she heard keys rattling in the front door, then a familiar sound of footsteps moving through their foyer. Joan turned to greet Dr. Chesney as he walked into the kitchen and threw his car keys on the built-in desk near the fridge. He had a distant look on his face, as though he were lost in thought. Joan frowned. She could tell that her husband was stressed out about something. As she pulled more vegetables from the fridge, she asked him what was wrong. Dr. Chesney sighed and told her all about his new patient, Rose, and her baffling list of symptoms. He was at a total dead end, and he needed his wife's help to figure out what was wrong with her. Joan nodded and put down her knife so she could think. Dr. Chesney's request was not unusual because Joan was also a doctor. The couple frequently bounced ideas off of each other when they had challenging cases. Joan was an infectious disease specialist, and odd cases like this came across her desk all the time. And to Joan, something about Rose's symptoms, the fever, shock, and kidney failure, sounded familiar, but for the life of her, she couldn't remember why. Joan asked more questions about Rose, hoping that something might jog her memory, but she had no luck. She promised her husband she'd keep thinking about it, and then she went back to chopping up the vegetables. Now she was lost in thought as well. When Joan woke up the next morning, Rose was immediately on her mind. In fact, the night before, she had even had a dream about Rose. It felt like the answer to what was going on with Rose was just beyond her fingertips. As Joan got out of bed, she decided she would pay Rose a visit herself that morning. She thought that maybe just seeing Rose in person might help her put the pieces together. An hour later, Joan followed her husband, Dr. Chesney, into Rose's room in the ICU. Joan was shocked as she laid eyes on Rose, who was still unconscious. The sunburned-looking rash now covered Rose's entire body, including the palms of her hands. Joan had never seen a rash like this in her entire career. She thought it looked almost like a chemical burn and wondered aloud if Rose could have been exposed to a chemical that her body absorbed through her skin. Or maybe she took a drug that her parents were not aware of at maybe a high school party or something like that. Dr. Chesney told his wife that the lab results should be ready any moment, and hopefully they would help them find an answer. Dr. Chesney said he'd go check on the test results' progress, and then he stepped out of the room. While Joan waited for him to come back, she decided to check Rose's pupils and her reflexes. So Joan pulled a flashlight from the pocket of her white lab coat and then gently pulled back Rose's eyelids. Joan was surprised to see that Rose's eyes were totally bloodshot. Joan was alarmed. She didn't know of any infections that caused shock and bloodshot eyes like this. She began to wonder if they were witnessing the birth of some new and potentially deadly disease. The prospect was terrifying, and it sent Joan hurrying out of the room and down the hallway to find her husband. Two mornings later, Joan was on her way out of the hospital to attend a local conference on infectious diseases. Rose's test results had finally come back, but they were inconclusive. Thankfully, Rose had finally woken up and was stable for the time being. But Joan and her husband were not any closer to solving her case. Joan hoped that talking to some colleagues at this conference might help her come up with some new ideas. But before she could leave the building, she received a page calling her down to the ER. This was unusual. She wondered why an infectious disease specialist would be needed in the emergency room. But in the pit of her stomach, she feared she already knew the answer. That she was right, that Rose was suffering from some brand new deadly disease, and now it was spreading, and so they might have new patients downstairs. Joan hustled across the hospital, anxiety really starting to settle in. Moments later, she rushed into the ER to find another young woman lying on a gurney covered in a sunburn-like rash who was also struggling to breathe. An ER doctor was helping two nurses wheel the patient into a hospital room. As Joan walked beside them, the doctor told her that the patient was a 15-year-old girl who had collapsed in her kitchen. Like Rose, this new patient had developed her symptoms suddenly, and her parents had rushed her to the hospital right after she'd collapsed. Joan suddenly felt a knot in her stomach. She knew that two young women with the same bizarre symptoms could not be a coincidence. But she didn't have time right now to worry about a potential new epidemic. The patient in front of her was crashing. Joan followed the ER doctor into the patient's room, and as she did, she told the doctor the exact cocktail of IV fluids and dialysis that her husband, Dr. Chesney, had given to Rose. The ER doctor thanked Joan for saving him a call up to the ICU. Joan gave him a grim smile. She knew this treatment she had suggested would likely stabilize this new patient for the time being, but she knew it would not cure her. Joan looked down at her watch and realized she might be late for this conference, and so she needed to leave right now. She needed to attend this conference really for the sake of Rose and this new patient. Joan hoped that one of her colleagues at this conference might recognize the symptoms these two girls were showing and be able to help figure out what was making them sick so they could finally treat them and cure them. An hour later, Joan walked into a large lecture hall, a styrofoam cup of coffee in her hand. The desks had all been arranged in a big circle, and so Joan took a seat on the far side of the room. There were already a few colleagues getting settled, and so Joan waved at a friend as she set her things down and took out her notepad. All morning, specialists took turns presenting cases that involved different infectious diseases. Some had been solved, and others still needed to be diagnosed. They were all interesting, but it was the last case that caught Joan's attention. The speaker handed around copies of a file for one of his current patients. She was a 25-year-old woman, also local to the area, and just like Rose and the 15-year-old girl at the hospital, this patient had also experienced sudden kidney failure, a high fever, and a sunburn-like rash. The presenter broadly described the diagnosis as kidney failure with shock, although they had no idea what had caused her kidneys to fail in the first place. As soon as the presentation was over, Joan hurried over to the last speaker to talk to them about their patient and maybe compare notes. The two doctors looked over the patient's files together, and quickly they saw all three cases were basically identical. The other doctor looked at Joan hopefully and asked if she'd been able to figure out what was making these young women go into shock. Joan just shook her head. She said she was still trying to figure it out, and in fact, that was why she had come over to talk to this doctor, because she was hopeful that they had the answer to what was going on. And so Joan silently ran over the symptoms again in her head, trying to put the pieces together, and then out of nowhere, it just clicked. Suddenly, Joan remembered where she had read about this disease before, in a journal article published a year earlier. That was why, when her husband, Dr. Chesney, had come home and first told her about the symptoms Rose was showing, they seemed so familiar. This article was the reason. Joan quickly thanked her colleague and promised she'd be in touch. Then she hurried out the door and drove back to the Madison Medical Center as fast as she could, and then nearly ran to her office. Once she got there, she began rummaging through the stacks of articles and journals that she'd spent the past 2 days piling up on her desk. Finally, she found the one she'd been looking for. It was in a medical journal called The Lancet. Joan flipped through the pages and found the article that had been published a year earlier. It described the case of an adolescent girl who'd suffered the exact same rashes and other symptoms as Rose and the other two patients. The article described how the girl had contracted a strange new illness caused by a potentially deadly bacteria that entered her body through an open wound. The result, the researchers concluded, was a disease that had never been seen before. Joan tapped her foot, thinking. The symptoms matched, but neither of her patients had any open wounds on their bodies. There was clearly some piece of the puzzle that was still missing. Joan decided to order one more test for both Rose and the 15-year-old girl to see if they were infected with the same bacteria as the girls referenced in this article. In a day or two, she would know whether her current cases and the cases from this article were actually linked. But in the meantime, she knew that if there were already 3 cases of this potential bacterial illness, there would be more. And so she decided it was now time to call the Wisconsin Department of Public Health and tell them they had a potentially very big problem on their hands. The next afternoon, Joan was sitting in her office catching up on paperwork when a tall man wearing a nice suit knocked on her doorframe. He looked anxious and out of breath as he introduced himself as Dr. Jeff Davis, an investigator with the State Department of Health. He'd spent the entire morning interviewing family members of the 3 women affected by this mystery disease. Joan stood up immediately and thanked him and said, "Please come in and sit down," but Dr. Davis just shook his head and said he couldn't stay. He just wanted Joan to know that he did find a link between the 3 cases. Dr. Davis explained that the 3 patients had almost nothing in common. They didn't eat the same things, they didn't go to the same places, or live similar lifestyles. The only thing they shared was the fact that they were all young women. And so he thought that they could have something in common biologically, and he'd wondered if maybe they had all been menstruating at the time they got sick. So he checked their charts and learned that yes, all 3 were having their period when their symptoms developed. Also, Rose, who was now able to speak, would tell Dr. Davis that she actually remembered getting a similar-looking rash on her body the month before when she had her period the last time. This was a promising link, but Dr. Davis said he didn't know what it meant, or if it was even relevant at all. After he was done speaking, Dr. Davis just looked at Joan expectantly, as though she could now solve the mystery. But Joan wasn't sure what to say. It didn't make sense. There was nothing about a period that would make these women so sick. But Joan knew that this connection was really all they had to go on, so she couldn't just dismiss the theory outright. And so instead, she took a seat and picked up Dr. Davis's notes from all the family meetings he had just had, and she began to read over them. The next morning, Joan stepped into her office to find the lab results sitting on her desk. She felt a rush of energy as she grabbed them and began scanning the documents in her hand. It would turn out both of her patients, Rose and the 15-year-old girl, had tested positive for a life-threatening infection from bacteria called Staphylococcus aureus. This was the same bacteria that infected the girls in the Lancet article Joan had read, which meant Rose and the 15-year-old girl had the new syndrome outlined in the article, which the researchers named toxic shock syndrome. Joan breathed a small sigh of relief. At least she knew what she was treating now. She hoped that with enough specialized care, both of her patients lying in the ICU would make a full recovery. But Joan still had a very big problem. She still didn't know how her patients could have contracted the deadly staph infection in the first place. They had no open wounds, no place for the bacteria to enter the bloodstream. She remembered Dr. Davis's observation that all the women were on their periods at the time. Joan wondered if Rose and the 15-year-old girl had taken a contaminated painkiller to alleviate their cramps, and maybe that's why they got sick. But this was only a theory, and until doctors figured it out, more people would likely get sick. Joan hoped Dr. Davis and the other investigators at the Department of Health would be able to find the cause quickly. About 6 weeks later, on a cold morning in late February 1980, an epidemiologist at the National Centers for Disease Control named Bruce Dan drove to work, feeling completely at a loss. He had spent almost 2 months trying to find the cause of the toxic shock infections in Madison, Wisconsin, and other locations all over the United States. To date, no one could figure out what was causing the illness or how to stop what was now a nationwide epidemic. By now, the mysterious infections had become national news. And as Dr. Dan pulled into the parking lot at the CDC, a story about toxic shock came on the radio. He listened as the reporter summarized the stats that Dr. Dan had already memorized. Since early December, 107 cases of toxic shock had surfaced in 33 states around the country. Thankfully, no deaths have been reported yet. Dr. Dan switched off the radio, parked his car, and walked to his office in silence. As he said good morning to his secretary handed him a stack of memos. This had become routine, because ever since the newspapers, TV, and radio started publishing daily reports on toxic shock, Dr. Dan had received hundreds of calls from women all across the country experiencing similar symptoms. Dr. Dan thanked the secretary and was about to leave when she stopped him and she handed him one more memo. He looked down at it, and as he read it, his stomach dropped. That morning, a young woman living in Wisconsin had become the first person to die from this mysterious infection. This woman was not one of Joan's patients, so she was not Rose or the 15-year-old girl, and in fact, by this point, Rose and the 15-year-old girl had actually fully recovered and were back with their families. But now it was clear to Dr. Dan that this infection could turn deadly, and Dr. Dan had been too late to stop it. He walked into his office so upset he wanted to kick his desk chair. He had always been very motivated to solve this mystery, but now his motivation was through the roof. He decided it was time for drastic action. He would find the answer to this riddle no matter the cost. Over the next few weeks, Dr. Dan and his team made thousands of phone calls interviewing women who were being treated for toxic shock. They also talked to young women who were not getting sick for comparison. At the end of each day, Dr. Dan would spend hours in his office reading the notes taken during each of these calls, searching for anything that stood out. Meanwhile, the number of toxic shock cases mounted. Within a month, more than 100 serious cases had been reported, and this only motivated Dr. Dan to work harder and stay later, losing himself in his notes. And finally, after 4 weeks of hard work, Dr. Dan found a link. He discovered that all the women who developed toxic shock syndrome used tampons when they menstruated, not pads. Dr. Dan sat at his desk, scratching his chin. He knew he was onto something. Granted, tampons had been on the market for more than 50 years. In fact, 50 million women use them every month in the United States alone. Out of that 50 million, only several hundred had gotten sick. So clearly, the vast majority of tampons were causing no problem at all. Dr. Dan rapped his pen on the desk thinking, and he wondered maybe it was just one brand of tampons that had somehow become contaminated in some way. And so he decided to begin calling tampon manufacturers, and what he found would finally solve the mystery. As Dr. Dan and his colleagues conducted their surveys, they discovered that in about 70% of the toxic shock cases, the women used tampons from a brand called Rely. Specifically, they used the heavily absorbent version. At first, this didn't make sense to Dr. Dan. Rely had introduced the heavily absorbent tampons 6 years earlier, in 1974, but there was no evidence linking them to toxic shock until this outbreak had started in late 1979. However, right before the outbreak began, Rely began using synthetic materials. And the other brands, which accounted for the other 30% of toxic shock cases, also were using synthetic materials, just not as much. It turned out that while these materials allowed for much better absorbency, they also helped promote the growth of the bacteria that causes toxic shock. Once Dr. Dan discovered the link between Rely tampons and toxic shock, the CDC published an article with their findings. For Dr. Joan Chesney and her husband Russell, the study was a huge relief. Thankfully, all their patients had fought off the deadly infection, and now that the word was out, they were hopeful the outbreak would taper off. After some initial resistance, Rely superabsorbent tampons were finally pulled from the shelves in September of 1980. By that point, 772 women had developed toxic shock syndrome from using tampons, and the majority of them used Rely tampons. Tragically, 38 of those women died. Their deaths inspired new industry regulations to reduce the absorbency of tampons and also to print mandatory warning labels on the boxes. And since then, toxic shock syndrome has become incredibly rare, with only a handful of deaths every year.
With nothing but borrowed plans, stayed up late talking about dreams we didn't quite understand. We ran on hope and cheap coffee, believed time was on our side. Didn't know growing up meant some parts of us stay behind. Funny how fast the years fly when you think you've got forever. Now I look back and wonder if we ever knew better. We were almost who we wanted to be, almost fearless, almost free. We were standing at the start of it all, with nowhere to fall. Yeah, we were young and unfinished.
From Ballen Studios and Wondery, this is MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, hosted by me, MrBallen. A quick note about our stories: we use aliases sometimes because we don't know the names of the real people in the story, and also, in most cases, we can't know exactly what was said, but everything is based on a lot of research. And a reminder, the content in this episode is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or